Welcome to Shepherd's Table. I'm your host, Ian Parkinson, and I have with me today Reverend Shane Hine from St. Peter Lutheran, Pastor Patrick Schoenberger from Heights Baptist, and Pastor Roland from Victory Lutheran. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks, Ian. Good to be back. Thank you.
So, youth has been an issue or a topic amongst a lot of congregations for quite a few generations, really. But now that we've come out of COVID and things are somewhat settling down, Pastor Shane, how do you see the youth coming back into your church?
Well, first of all, I'm not huge on targeting a demographic.
Okay.
Right? And the reason for that is as soon as you go, okay, we need to bring the youth back, that automatically sends leadership into sort of this marketing mode. The church is not a business.
Okay.
It has a business aspect, but it in itself is not a business, because as soon as you start thinking of it in that sense, then we start thinking in terms of money and numbers.
Yes.
Instead of gospel, right? To me, there's a more fundamental question. Why are people in general not coming to church these days?
Okay.
What are we missing? I don't know if the churches are actually missing anything. Perhaps it is more because we live in such an affluent culture, and you see this in Scripture, as soon as the culture becomes more affluent, they sort of lose their perceived need for God.
Yeah.
Right? And one of the things recently that brought this mode of thinking back into my mind was I had a young man, he's probably 17, show up in church, I don't know, probably a year ago, with his mother.
Okay.
So I waited a couple of weeks. He showed up again and again, and usually I don't approach them right away because I don't want to scare them off, right?
Yeah.
But so I approached him later and I asked him, "Hey, what are you doing here, bud? Like, how are things going? How did you find us? That kind of thing." And he goes, I spent weeks on the internet. So it turns out he was bringing her to church, his mom, right?
Okay.
And he spent weeks on the internet just going, I'm just trying to find a solid gospel church, somewhere where I can go and hear the message. So that brought back into focus into my mind, do we want to try and target a demographic, or do we want to do what Jesus said and preach the gospel, let the chips fall where they may?
Fishers of men.
Right, exactly, yes. Yeah. So that would be sort of where I'm at on the subject.
So then the internet is more of a Gen Y millennial type thing. So this is actually providing information for somebody who's looking.
Yes. Well, and it brings up the whole question, how do we reach not just the youth, but and not a particular demographic, how do we reach people?
Yeah.
Because the door-to-door thing really doesn't work, as we know, and we're not back in Jesus' time where everybody is just expected to be confronted by some sort of a spiritual message at some point. Today is very, very, very different, of course, in our Western culture. So how do we reach those people? Well, the internet, of course, is a place where everybody goes for almost everything, right? So
Both
if you
positive and negative.
Exactly, yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah. So that's really the danger. And when I talked to this kid, it gave me a lot of hope.
Yeah.
That he wasn't just looking for, this church building looks cool, or that pastor looks very relevant to the culture, whatever the case may be. He was reading, right?
Yeah.
Which takes a while. So
there's been some effort and study put into it.
Absolutely, yeah. So that brings me hope. Now it's just one guy.
Yeah, well, it's a start.
It's a spark that could light a fire, right?
What about you, Pastor Patrick, and your congregation?
Well, I really appreciate what Shane had to say about it. What I'd like to do is actually just take a step back.
Sure.
We're talking about how to bring youth to the church. Maybe we need to step back and say, why have so many youth left the church over the years? And about 15 years ago, the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada was involved in commissioning a sociological study called Hemorrhaging Faith. And it was looking at the question of why do so many young people leave the church? And the study found that most young people left the church at what were called transition points. So, for example, a lot of children and young people in the church are not really in the church. And what I mean by that is when children come to the church, they're treated as sort of second-class citizens. We segregate and we send the kids to a Sunday school, to a children's church, to a youth group, something like that. A lot of children grow up not being in the worship service, not being a part of the congregation because they've been segregated in some way. And then at some point, when they reach a certain age, they're expected to integrate and assimilate into the congregation. But according to the study, that's when they fall away.
Yes.
Because they can't do it. They've never been a part of the church. They've always been separated in some way, and when they're expected to reintegrate at the age of 12 or 16 or whenever that is, they can't do it and they fall away. And so really, I think the model that we need to look at, perhaps instead of segregating people in the church, we need to look more at an intergenerational model where we're including children and youth in the body from an earlier age, so that there's a sense of ownership in the church,
yes,
so that they feel a part of the congregation. And you're going to avoid some of those transition points that are going to perhaps facilitate opportunities for young people to fall away from the church. So I think that's the first thing. It's like, before you can fill the sink, you need to fix the hole in it, sort of
yes,
thing. And I think, they're two sides of the same coin. How do we, draw or reach young people from the church, but as well, how do we prevent young people from leaving the church? And I think both of those issues are important.
It's interesting because my congregation went through the same thing about 10 years ago. Should we have Sunday school before, during, or after? And the intent after about 4 years of discussion was after. Mm-hmm. And then the children stay in the sanctuary, listen to the minister, and understand the service.
Yeah.
And they're not just cast off down the hallway to play crayons and do arts and crafts. What about your congregation, Pastor Roland?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's the perennial question, right? How do you attract and retain individuals? I think the mistake that the churches often make, to Pastor Shane's point, is you try everything to attract the youth, but you scare away your other demographics,
yeah,
right? I've watched many churches shipwreck themselves being like, we're going to change the whole service, we're going to change all the music, and all your older folks abandon ship, right? And that becomes a very big problem because, yes, the young people bring the life, but the old people bring the stability, bring the financial support, bring the, you need the young and the old in every congregation. So I would agree with what Pastor Shane's saying of that. And to Pastor Patrick's point, I think the other point that is worthy of note is that idea of don't exile the children. Yes. Let the little children come to me, not let the little children make a macaroni, art piece during,
yes,
and obviously there's nothing wrong with Sunday school. I think my preference would be to have Sunday school either before or after the service. At Victory, what we do is the children stay in until for the first sort of 10 minutes of the service, and then they're sent off, and then they come back for communion, so the last sort of 15 minutes. So they're only gone for about 30 minutes from the service, which, like I said, I don't think that's ideal, but the kids are still getting the integration into the wider congregation, so they're not totally ignorant of how we do things, the way in which the church operates. But in terms of the question of youth, I think the other thing to sort of roll back a bit is a lot of churches I don't actually think know how to evangelize because they've been too dependent on birth rate.
yes,
It's the typical growth model for many churches is have children, those children come to church, and they have children and they come to church. And then when that system broke down, a lot of churches were sitting there like, well, now what are we supposed to do? So I think actually in our time, a lot of churches are rediscovering what it means to share the gospel again. And I'm not saying so much for the evangelicals. I mean, that's always been baked into their movement. But for mainline Protestants like Anglicans, Lutherans, Presbyterians, we've always had a built-in population.
Yeah.
We've never really had to be like, we have to go out and get people. And I think that's something we need to rediscover if we want to attract any demographic, youth or older.
Well, and I think too, again, I'll start with Pastor Shane, is a lot of young people have likely grown up outside of an organized church organization. So how can you make it welcoming and friendly without scaring them off?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing or a negative thing that a lot of these kids had grown up outside of a church setting, because a lot of them, maybe not a lot of them, some of them do not approach the church with a whole lot of baggage.
Yes.
That they would have picked up had they been in church with the, kind of how we've always done things type of mentality, right? So this young man I was just talking about, he wasn't particularly churched before. He had no blood relations or anybody, no connections to St. Peter at all. He just found it to be appealing just on our simple statement that we preach the message and we administer the sacraments, and that's really what he was after. So I think that is really going to be the key moving forward. And we were talking just off camera before, the three of us, just about there is a movement among the youth that gives us a little bit of hope, where they have finally figured out that they are not finding what they need in secularism.
Yes.
So there is this movement back, and starting with the Catholics, I think we were talking about, but certainly among the others as well, this movement back toward finding something a little more solid to set their feet down on.
Well,
right.
Pastor Patrick, I mean, a lot of these youngsters, I get the impression, are looking for a base or a platform or stability or something to hang on to.
Yeah, well, and I think you're right. And I want to maybe push back a bit. We've used a little bit today the word attract. I don't like to use the word attract because what some churches have done, and it's kind of an extreme example, but you have mega churches that have turned their buildings into kind of amusement parks and coffee bars, and their worship service is a rock concert. And, you can do all of these things. Some mega churches you go into, it looks like a shopping mall. And you can attract people to an event. But as soon as there's a better show in town, they move on. And when we do this, when the church seeks to imitate the world, to be entertaining in that way, to attract people, you have to ask yourself, are we making disciples as Jesus called us to do? Or are we producing religious consumers?
Yeah.
I want the kind of message that I want. I want the kind of music that I want. I want the programs that I want. I want my ears tickled. And I think at the end of the day, it's not about quantity, it's about quality.
Yeah.
And I think people are looking for something to hold on to. And I know that, again, earlier we were talking, some people, they're looking for tradition, structure, authority, stability, all of those things. Some people are drawn, for example, to the Latin Mass in the Catholic tradition. And even outside of the Christian world, we see some young people drawing to other religions like Islam or something because they believe that sort of provides a structure or something that they're looking for. I think the answer for the church in terms of reaching young people is not to imitate the world, but to be different from the world.
Yes.
And I think, at the end of the day, that's what we want to do, because the church, the Greek word ecclesia, it literally means one's called out from. We're called out from the world. We're called to be different from the world. We're not called to be like the world. And I think what we need to do, instead of talking about attracting people, I think we need to reach people.
Yeah.
And that's the word that I would prefer to use.
What do you think, Pastor Roland?
Yeah, I would very much agree, I think, with what both of my colleagues are saying. And language is very important, and I'm glad Patrick brought that up. You have to be precise in the words that you're using. We're not marketers. We're not offering a product or a service. We are proclaiming something eternally true, which is life-giving, and that's the Word of God through Jesus Christ. And I think we live in a world of a lot of fake.
Yes.
Right? And social media amplifies that, right? It's very easy to make your life look really good on social media, to, modify your pictures, to take a few pounds off or make your face look more square or whatever you want, right? I don't know. It shows you how much I know that. Yeah.
Give yourself more hair?
Yeah, exactly. Give yourself a nice thick Liberace or hairstyle or whatever. But the point is, I think the younger people actually want authenticity.
Yes.
And I think they know when they're being sold garbage or a gimmick, right? They're not interested in gimmicks or games. And I would also agree with the point Patrick was making. Like, you can't compete with the world. You're never going to be more entertaining, more fun, more exciting than the world. But what can the church offer that the world can't? Jesus Christ. Right? And I think if we're not introducing people to him, then what are we doing? We might as well just be a community center.
Yeah, because there was another line. 'Cause I remember the first two. I am the way, the life.
Yeah, John 14:6. I'm
Way,
the
the truth, the life.
Yeah. What other issues are you facing, Pastor Shane?
As far as church attendance,
Yeah.
in general, I think there's a lot of apathy
Yeah.
in the West in particular. But I think that goes. There's many reasons for that. Certainly, the affluence of the West, which I'm not against in principle, but I think it does contribute to people's perception of how they should live their lives. Because they, church is habit forming
Yes.
as well, right? So through the lockdowns, for instance, I tried really hard to keep the building open as much as I could, even bucking
Yes.
the rules, I will admit on camera. But I did that because I knew, just from experience, that if you go too long, people will find other things to do on Sunday morning. People that are generally pretty faithful,
Yes.
otherwise, but they'll find things that are a lot more fun than going to church. And that's pretty hard to break that habit.
Well, and habit is an interesting topic because any addiction counselor will tell you you have to change your routine to get out of this habit you have.
Yeah. And I mean, let's face it, the generations today do not have the greatest generation's discipline.
Yes.
So they are, they're not laser focused on any particular area like we used to be back in yesteryear. And of course, there's other issues too. I mean, we can keep ourselves entertained from the moment, kind of to Pastor Patrick's point before.
Right.
We can keep ourselves sufficiently entertained from the moment we get up to the moment we go to bed, and not think about anything about mortality or what it means to be human in a spiritual sense, even in a physical sense. None of that.
Well, and I think a lot of the youngsters don't realize that while the reverend or the pastor or the priest or the vicar, whoever is the face of the building and the congregation, there is actually a council behind all of you that you have to report to. I don't think they understand that. What do you think, Patrick?
Well, when it comes to young people in the church, I think a lot of principles come to play. For example, I've talked in a previous show about the importance of relationships. So the church offers Jesus Christ, the gospel, the word of God, salvation, the sacraments, the ordinances, those sorts of things. So the church offers those things. But as well, it needs to be a place for authentic community.
Yes.
We live, and Roland referred to this, kind of the social media thing, we live in a fake world. There are a lot of things that are fake, and I think people are searching for something that's authentic and real. And I've said before in a previous episode that, I think, from my experience, people come to church. Why? Because of relationships. My friend invited me.
Yes.
My son brought me. Yeah. Why do people stay in the church? Because they have relationships, because I have friends here, because I have family here, because I have community here. Why do they leave the church? My friends left. And so that's kind of been my experience. And I think as well, there's something that sociologists refer to as the homogeneous unit principle. Like attracts like. And so, you need a sort of a critical mass. So if you have a church with a lot of young people attract young people.
Yeah.
Old people attract old people. Asian people attract Asian people. Whatever you want to use. And I think that's the challenge for a lot of churches is having that critical mass in terms of demographics, but as well fostering authentic community and getting back to relationships. I grew up in a Roman Catholic church, and that really wasn't the focus is very much in the Roman Catholic Church on the sacraments and the priest and that sort of thing. Community wasn't really something that was talked about. And I know that our focus at Heights Baptist Church is very much on we use the words family and fellowship and community a lot because we certainly think it's through authentic relationships that people will be drawn to the church and rooted in the church. And Jesus used that model as well. He called disciples who followed him, and these men lived in community together for 3 years. And that's really the origins of the church.
Mm-hmm. Pastor Roland.
Yeah, going back to what Pastor Shane was saying about apathy, I had written a journal article a couple of years back that was published on apatheism, which is the idea of it's not so much that people are rejecting God, it's just they don't think he has any particular bearing on their lives. Mm-hmm. And so it's less a rejection of the divine. Like the thing that I've found, there are very few actual atheists, like very few people that will come and say, there is no God. There are a lot of people that will say something and, yeah, there might be a God, but who cares? Or, I just kind of do my own thing with the divine, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of those people. And so to me, it's tapping into that question of, well, why might you need a community? And one of the phrases I always love to say is, God left behind a church. He didn't leave behind an individual spiritual journey.
Yes.
And I think that's an important point. The church is a place of accountability. The church is a place of mutual support and consolation, right? And you see that at work, and you cultivate that. That's what you want. And to Patrick's point, that idea of cultivating that community, it is intentional in the way you speak about it, in the way you envision it, because we are competing with also in our time the cult of hurry. And what I mean by that is, everyone is so busy. It's like you got school and then hockey practice and then this and then that, and that there's so much going on all the time. And in the busyness, in the noise, how do you come in and say, well, hold on a second, right? Maybe you need to take a breather. Maybe you need to take a Sabbath and rest from that and be invited into a community where you don't need to do anything. Yeah. Christ has done it for you. Receive what Christ has given you in faith. Right? And I think that's truly revolutionary to a time that's consumed by, A, then B, then C, then D. And God is just saying, come and rest in my presence.
Yeah. Yes. Come and sit with me.
Yeah, come and sit with me. Yeah. Exactly.
So now Easter is over. Which season are we in now? I'm showing my ignorance here.
No, that's okay. We are still in Easter.
Okay.
So Easter is, I believe, this 3 more Sundays in the Easter season, and then we move on to Pentecost. So that the Pentecost Sunday is considered to be the birthday of the church.
Okay.
And Pentecost season is by far the longest season of the year. It's the big green season, as we refer to in the Lutheran tradition, and it lasts all the way till Advent.
Okay, yeah, because my background many decades ago was Church of England, and you just explained why after Easter they went from the white to the green.
Yes.
On the pulpit.
Yeah. Yes. So we're adorned in white for another few weeks, and then we switch to green. Green is practically half the year, wouldn't you say, Pastor Earl? Yeah. So
takes you into the fall.
Yes.
What about your congregation, Pastor Patrick?
Well, I was going to say, as Baptists, we're not quite as tied to the lectionary, to the church year, and those sorts of things, and certainly recognize the feasts of Easter and Pentecost and those sorts of things. But we're not using colors and those sorts of things. So we're not. It's more of a free tradition. But I wanted to get back to what these gentlemen have said and the words of apathy. And as Shane said earlier, this thing about our standard of living and wealth. And it's true that 2 things happen when you see an increase in the standard of living. You see a decline in the birth rate, and you see a decline in interest in spirituality.
Yes.
And we've seen that really for centuries now, primarily in North America and Western Europe, where, again, we've seen the decline of the church, we've seen the decline of the birth rate. And that sort of, people are distracted by wealth. And I think we see that, and a lot of times people don't want to be distracted by children because they're distracted by wealth, and they don't want to be distracted by the church because they're distracted by wealth, and they want to do holidays and all those things that the standard of living affords them. And it's interesting that the church really is seeing the most explosive growth in places in Latin America and Africa and things like that have a lower standard of living, and as well, of course, they have a higher birth rate in those places. And I think that those are some of the challenges that we deal with in the West. It's apathy and it's complacency in terms of the church. And I think the church has to find ways to engage. And I appreciate what Shane said during COVID, the lockdowns. Trying to find a way to keep the building open so that the church continues to be a part of people's habits, a part of their routine. And you know, I know for our church, after the first few months of the COVID lockdowns, we just stayed fully open, and you know, we were full. There was no distancing, there was no masks, there was none of that, and it was actually a great opportunity because for once, we didn't have to compete with the world because there were no hockey games.
Yes.
You know, all that stuff was canceled, and so you know, we had people actually that had never really come to church or who were very hit and miss with church actually come on a regular basis during the COVID lockdowns because there was nothing else going on. But what we saw when the COVID lockdowns ended and things opened up again, they went back to the hockey rink. So you have that sort of sense of apathy returns.
Yes. Well, I think it's Winston Churchill that said, full stomachs have a short memory.
Yeah.
Pastor Roland, you get to close.
Oh, lucky me. Well, the last thing I would want to point out, and I think this seems to be a bit of a culmination, I think in our society, in our wealthy, affluent society, where, you know, we really don't have so many of the problems that face people in the rest of the world. It's not like we don't have hunger. It's not like there isn't poverty, but compared to some other countries, we're very comfortable, and you can spend most of your days living for your own pleasure and enjoyment, right? You know, you nuke your brain with dopamine all day, every day, right? Basically. But the thing that I find interesting about the church, I think it's one of the last institutions in our society that still says no.
Yep.
And it still says maybe everything isn't all about you. And there are very few institutions, there are very few places that say that anymore. The schools don't say that anymore, right? And a lot of times people have sort of rebranded narcissism as what they call main character syndrome, right? And it's this idea that you're the main character and everyone else is just side characters in your story.
Yes.
Right? And the church says, actually, no, the main character is Jesus Christ. And that position's already been taken, right? And you're in his story, right? And I think that is where the church can really push on that unique voice.
Yeah.
Because we are the only ones saying, maybe you shouldn't do that. Maybe life isn't all about you. Maybe there's something bigger than yourself. Maybe you owe your neighbor something, like love and mercy and grace. Maybe you shouldn't pursue anger and bitterness, right?
Yep.
What other institution is doing that?
None that I can think of.
Exactly.
Exactly the opposite, actually.
And everyone else is saying, indulge, indulge, indulge. And the church says,
You deserve.
fast
You deserve. Yep.
and stop. And, you know,
Well, it always reminds me of the Roman Empire with the barbarians at the gate. What barbarians? Thank you for coming in, gentlemen.
Thanks so much, Ian.
Thank you.
Pastor Roland, good luck with your sabbatical.
Thank
May
you.
you be refreshed and renewed. And we'll talk again soon. Thank you again.
thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you for watching Shepherd's Table.